Admiral Kira Vance stood alone on the observation deck of the UHS Retribution, the largest warship humanity had ever built. The lights were dim. She had ordered them that way. In the darkness, the holographic display floating before her seemed more real, more alive, more painful. She pressed a button on her wrist console, and Earth appeared. Not the dead Earth, not the broken Earth, the Earth from before, captured by a satellite 41 years ago on a quiet Tuesday morning. Blue oceans sparkled under white clouds. Green continents stretched across the globe like old friends waving hello. City lights glittered on the night side. Millions of lives going about their business, completely unaware of what was coming. Kira had watched this recording 10,000 times. Maybe more. She had memorized every cloud formation, every swirl of ocean current, every tiny detail. Her daughter had been down there somewhere, in a small apartment in Vancouver, probably making breakfast for her own children, Kira's grandchildren. She had never met them in person. She had been stationed on Mars when it happened, preparing for a routine patrol mission. She had promised to visit for Christmas. Christmas never came. She pressed another button, and the recording continued. The first Zorvathi ships appeared at the edge of the solar system at 0347 hours, Universal Standard Time. There were thousands of them, more ships than humanity had ever seen in one place. They moved with terrible purpose, ignoring the outer planets, ignoring the defense stations that fired uselessly at their hulls. They came straight for Earth like wolves hunting a wounded deer. The battle lasted 6 hours. Humanity threw everything it had at the invaders. Battleships, fighters, orbital defense platforms, nuclear missiles, kinetic impactors. None of it mattered. The Zorvathi technology was centuries ahead. Human weapons bounced off their shields like raindrops off a window. Human ships exploded by the hundreds, while Zorvathi vessels pushed forward without slowing. By hour 7, the defense fleet was gone. Scattered debris and frozen bodies drifted where proud warships had once stood guard. And then, the Zorvathi planet crackers moved into position. Kira watched the recording with dry eyes. She had no tears left. She had cried them all out decades ago. The planet crackers were massive vessels, each one the size of a small moon. They positioned themselves in a precise formation around Earth and began charging their weapons. It took 3 hours. 3 hours while 8 billion people watched the sky and prayed to whatever gods they believed in. 3 hours while emergency broadcasts told people to stay calm, to seek shelter, to hope for rescue that would never come. At 1,342 hours, the planet crackers fired. Beams of pure energy, brighter than the sun, struck Earth's surface at 12 different points. The oceans began to boil. The crust cracked open like an egg. Magma erupted from wounds that stretched across entire continents. The atmosphere caught fire. 17 hours later, Earth was gone. Not conquered, not occupied, gone. A field of molten rock and scattered debris where a living world had once existed. 8 billion people, reduced to atoms and memory. Kira ended the recording. The holographic Earth vanished, and she stood alone in the darkness. 41 years. For 41 years, she had carried this weight. For 41 years, she had lived with a hole in her chest where her heart used to be. For 41 years, she had worked toward one single purpose: revenge. A soft chime interrupted her thoughts. She straightened her uniform and turned toward the door. Enter. The door slid open, and Commander Chen Wei stepped through. He was her second in command, a solid man in his 50s with gray hair and steady hands. He had been born on a refugee ship 3 months after Earth burned. He had never known a home world, never walked under an open sky without a helmet, never breathed air that wasn't recycled. But he had grown up on stories. Stories of green forests and blue oceans. Stories of cities full of laughter. Stories of everything humanity had lost. "Admiral," he said, his voice formal, "the fleet is assembled. All 900,000 ships report ready for departure. 900,000 warships." Kira let that number sink in. 40 years ago, the survivors of Earth's destruction had numbered just 12 million, scattered across colony ships, space stations, lunar bases, and Martian settlements. They were the last remnants of a species that had once dreamed of conquering the stars. In those early days, survival seemed impossible. Resources were scarce. Hope was scarcer, but humanity did not die. Humanity hid, humanity grieved, and then humanity got angry. The Exodus Protocol had been a secret project, created by paranoid military planners who wanted a backup plan in case Earth ever fell to an alien invasion. Most people thought it was a waste of money, a fantasy scenario that would never happen. Those paranoid planners had saved the human race. Hidden shipyards in asteroid belts, secret resource caches on distant moons, manufacturing templates stored in encrypted databases, everything humanity needed to rebuild, waiting in the darkness of space for survivors to find it. And find it they did. The first decade after Earth's destruction was about survival, finding food, water, shelter, keeping the population alive, keeping hope alive. The second decade was about growth, expanding the hidden colonies, increasing the population, building infrastructure. The third decade was about preparation, designing new weapons, training new soldiers, constructing warships by the thousands. The fourth decade was about one thing only: vengeance. Kira walked to the main viewport and looked out at the fleet. Ships stretched in every direction as far as she could see. Destroyers, cruisers, battleships, carriers, dreadnoughts. Every single one of them carried the same inscription on its hull, painted in letters 10 meters tall. Remember Earth. These ships had been built by people who had never seen Earth except in recordings, crewed by men and women who had grown up in metal corridors and artificial gravity, who had never felt real rain on their faces or real wind in their hair. But they knew what had been taken from them. They knew who had taken it, and they were ready to take payment in blood. What about the Zorvathi? Kira asked. Any movement on long-range sensors? Commander Chen shook his head. Nothing, Admiral. Their border patrols haven't changed position in months. They don't know we're coming. Kira allowed herself a small smile. The Zorvathi had underestimated humanity from the very beginning. They had seen a young species, barely capable of interstellar travel, and decided to wipe them out like insects. They had destroyed Earth and moved on, probably forgetting about humanity within a few years. After all, what threat could 12 million refugees possibly pose? They were about to find out. Signal the fleet, Kira ordered. We begin the jump sequence in 1 hour. Chen nodded and turned to leave, but hesitated at the door. Admiral, may I speak freely? Always. He turned back to face her. I've served under your command for 20 years. I've watched you sacrifice everything for this moment. Your health, your relationships, your peace of mind, and I've never once questioned whether it was worth it. He paused. But now that we're actually here, I find myself wondering, after we destroy them, after we burn their worlds the way they burned ours, what then? What happens to us when the war is over? Kira considered the question. It was a fair one. For 40 years, humanity had been united by a single purpose. Revenge had given them something to live for, something to fight for, something to build toward. Without that purpose, what would they become? She didn't know. And truthfully, she didn't care. We'll figure that out after they're dead, she said. One thing at a time, Commander. One thing at a time. Chen nodded slowly, accepting her answer even if he wasn't satisfied by it. He left the observation deck, and Kira was alone again. She returned her gaze to the fleet. Somewhere out there, in one of those hundreds of thousands of ships, young men and women were preparing for the mission of their lives. They were checking weapons, running diagnostics, writing letters to loved ones that might never be sent. They were scared and excited and determined, just like every soldier before every battle in the history of warfare. But this was not going to be a battle. Battles implied two sides fighting. This was going to be an extermination. Humanity had spent 40 years learning from their defeat, studying Zorvathi technology through captured fragments and intercepted signals, developing countermeasures and new weapons. The fleet that hung in space around her was not the same helpless collection of ships that had been swept aside on the day Earth burned. This fleet was a weapon of genocide, and Kira intended to use it. Her thoughts drifted to her daughter again. Maya had been 32 years old when she died. A school teacher with a husband and 2 children. She had always been the peaceful one in the family, the one who believed in talking through problems, in finding common ground, in giving people second chances. She would have hated what her mother had become, but Maya was dead. Her husband was dead. Her children were dead. 8 billion people were dead, and the ones who killed them were still alive, still breathing, still still existing in a universe that no longer contained Earth. That was unacceptable. That was an imbalance in the cosmic scales that Kira intended to correct. The hour passed quickly. Kira made her way to the bridge, where her command crew was assembled and ready. The bridge of the Retribution was a massive circular room, filled with holographic displays and tactical stations. 200 officers worked at their posts, monitoring every aspect of the fleet's operation. Kira took her seat in the command chair at the center of the room. A holographic display materialized before her, showing the positions of all 900,000 ships. They were arranged in precise formations, each vessel knowing exactly where it needed to be and what it needed to do. "Fleet status?" she asked. "All ships report ready, Admiral." Commander Chen responded from his station. "Jump drives are charged. Navigation coordinates are locked in. We are awaiting your order." Kira nodded. This was the moment. 40 years of preparation, 40 years of building, 40 years of waiting, all leading to this single instant. She opened a channel to the entire fleet. Her face appeared on screens in every ship, from the smallest fighter to the largest dreadnought. 900,000 vessels fell silent, waiting for their admiral to speak. "Soldiers of humanity," she began, her voice steady and strong. 41 years ago, we lost everything. Our home, our families, our future. 8 billion of our brothers and sisters died screaming while an alien empire watched and laughed. They thought they had destroyed us. They thought humanity was finished. She paused, letting her words sink in. They were wrong. We survived. We hid in the darkness, licked our wounds, and rebuilt. We took our grief and turned it into steel. We took our rage and turned it into weapons. And now, after 4 decades of preparation, we are ready to answer the crime that was committed against our species. The bridge crew listened in silence, their faces hard with determination. Today, we begin the final journey. Today, we sail for Zorvathi space. And when we arrive, we will show them what it means to murder a world. We will burn their cities, shatter their fleets, and turn their empire to ash. We will make them understand, in their final moments, that humanity is not a species to be trifled with. She leaned forward in her chair, her eyes burning with cold fire. They took Earth from us. We will take everything from them. Today, we balance the scales. Today, we make them pay. Today, we remember Earth and avenge her children. Across the fleet, soldiers cheered. The sound was picked up by communication systems and broadcast through the command network. A wave of fury and determination that washed over every ship. 40 years of grief and rage. Finally finding release, Kira waited for the cheering to subside, then gave the order that would change the galaxy forever. "All ships, initiate jump sequence. Take us to war." The jump drives activated across the fleet. Space itself seemed to twist and tear as 900,000 vessels punched holes in reality and vanished into wormhole corridors. One moment, the fleet was there, a massive armada filling the void. The next moment, they were gone, leaving behind only empty space and the distant stars. The journey to Zorvathi space would take months. The route was dangerous, passing through unstable wormhole corridors that no sane species would attempt. But humanity was no longer sane. Humanity was patient, furious, and precise. Humanity was coming for blood, and nothing in the universe was going to stop them. In her quarters that night, Kira sat in darkness and looked at a small holographic photo. It showed a young woman with dark hair and a bright smile, standing in a garden full of flowers. Maya, on her wedding day, happy and hopeful and so impossibly alive. "I'm coming, sweetheart," Kira whispered to the image. "I'm going to make them pay for what they did to you. I promise. I promise." The photo smiled back at her, frozen forever in a moment of joy that would never come again. Outside, the fleet hurtled through twisted space, carrying 900,000 instruments of vengeance toward an enemy that did not know they were coming, carrying the last hope of a murdered species, carrying the fury of 8 billion ghosts who demanded justice. Earth would be remembered, Earth would be avenged, and the Zorvathi would learn, in fire and blood, the price of genocide. The war was just beginning. The journey through the wormhole corridors was like traveling through the throat of a living creature. Space twisted and bent in ways that hurt the eyes. Colors that should not exist flickered at the edges of vision. Time itself seemed to stretch and compress. making hours feel like days and days feel like minutes. Lieutenant Commander Dren Castillo stood at his tactical station on the bridge of the Retribution, monitoring the fleet's passage through the 37th wormhole corridor. His screens showed nothing but swirling chaos outside, but his instruments told him that all 900,000 ships were maintaining formation, moving as one toward their destination. Dren was 28 years old. He had been born on a generation ship called the Wanderer, 3 years after Earth's destruction. He had never seen a planet with his own eyes, never felt real gravity that wasn't generated by spinning habitats, never known anything but metal walls and recycled air and the burning need for revenge. His parents had been teenagers when Earth burned. They had watched the recordings together as children, sitting in crowded refugee holds while adults wept around them. They had grown up in the chaos of the early Exodus years, when survival was never certain and death was always close. And they had raised their son on stories. Stories of Earth. Stories of blue skies and green forests. Stories of oceans so vast you could not see the other side. Stories of cities full of people laughing, working, living their lives without fear of the void. And stories of the day when it all ended. The day when the Zorvathi came and took everything away. Dren had memorized those stories. He had made them part of his soul. He had never known Earth, but he loved it with a fierce devotion that surprised even himself. And he hated the Zorvathi with equal intensity. This mission was everything he had trained for his entire life. Every simulation, every drill, every sleepless night studying tactical manuals and weapon systems, all of it had been building toward this moment. He was finally going to make the Zorvathi pay. He was finally going to avenge a world he had never seen. The wormhole corridor stabilized, and normal space returned. Stars appeared on the view screens, cold and distant and familiar. The fleet emerged from the corridor in perfect formation. Not a single ship lost to the chaotic passage. Jump complete, Dren reported. All ships accounted for. Initiating navigation check for Corridor 38. Admiral Vance nodded from her command chair. She looked tired, Dren noticed. Dark circles under her eyes. A tightness around her mouth that never seemed to relax. She had been pushing herself harder than anyone during the journey, sleeping only a few hours each night, spending most of her time studying intelligence reports and refining battle plans. Dren understood. For him, this mission was about avenging a concept, a world he knew only from recordings and stories. For the Admiral, it was personal. She had lost her daughter on Earth, her grandchildren, her entire life. The hatred that drove her was not abstract. It was carved into her bones. How many more jumps until we reach Zorvathi space? She asked. 90 more corridors, Admiral. At our current pace, approximately 4 more months. 4 months. It seemed like forever, but after 40 years of waiting, what was 4 more months? The Zorvathi would still be there. They would still be unprepared, and humanity would still be coming. In another section of the ship, Dr. Yuki Tanaka sat in her research laboratory, surrounded by screens filled with Zorvathi text and audio recordings. She was 63 years old, a xenoanthropologist who had spent her entire career studying an enemy she had never met face to face. Yuki had been born on Mars, one of the lucky few who had been off-world when Earth died. She remembered the day it happened. She had been 7 years old, playing in a garden dome when the adults started screaming and crying. She had not understood what was happening at first. How could a child understand that an entire world had just been erased from existence? But she had grown up in the aftermath. She had seen what grief and rage did to people. She had watched refugees tear themselves apart with hatred and despair, and she had decided, even as a young woman, that understanding was the first step toward healing. So she had dedicated her life to studying the Zorvathi, not to sympathize with them, not to forgive them, but to understand them. What kind of species could commit such an act? What motivated them? What drove them to destroy an entire world for no apparent reason? For decades, she had collected every scrap of information she could find. Intercepted communications, recovered artifacts, prisoner interrogations from the rare Zorvathi scouts that humanity captured. She had learned their language, studied their culture, analyzed their social structures, and over the years, she had begun to notice something strange. The Zorvathi were changing. In the early years after Earth's destruction, their communications had been triumphant. Celebrations of victory, plans for further expansion, discussions of future conquests. They had spoken of humanity the way a hunter might speak of a pest that had been exterminated. They had been proud of what they had done, but gradually, the tone had shifted. The triumphant broadcasts became less frequent. Reports of military operations became scattered and confused. Communications between Zorvathi worlds grew shorter, more desperate, more fearful. And then, about 15 years ago, they had nearly stopped entirely. Yuki had reported her findings to military intelligence multiple times. Something was wrong in the Zorvathi Empire. Something had changed. But no one wanted to hear it. The military was focused on revenge, not analysis. They did not care what was happening to the Zorvathi. They only cared about making them suffer. Now, as the fleet drew closer to Zorvathi space, Yuki's unease was growing. The most recent intercepted signals were deeply troubling. Distress calls that went unanswered. Pleas for help from isolated outposts. Automated emergency beacons repeating the same warning over and over. Quarantine in effect. Do not approach. Something was very wrong. And Yuki was afraid that when the fleet finally arrived at Zorvathi Prime, they would not find what they expected. She gathered her latest findings and made her way to the Admiral's ready room. It was time to make her concerns heard, whether anyone wanted to listen or not. Admiral Vance was reviewing tactical projections when the door chimed. She looked up, irritated at the interruption. Enter. Dr. Tanaka stepped through, clutching a data tablet to her chest like a shield. Vance knew the xenoanthropologist by reputation. Brilliant researcher, but too soft for military work, too focused on understanding the enemy rather than destroying them. Admiral, I apologize for interrupting, but I have information that I believe is critical to the mission. Vance leaned back in her chair. Then speak, Doctor. Quickly. Yuki took a deep breath and began. She explained her research, her decades of studying Zorvathi communications, the gradual changes she had observed. She showed Vance the data, the intercepted signals, the distress calls, the quarantine warnings. Something catastrophic has happened to the Zorvathi Empire, she concluded. I believe they may be in a state of collapse. We need to proceed with caution. We need to understand what we are sailing into before we commit to battle. Vance listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When Yuki finished, the Admiral sat motionless for a long moment. Let me understand, Vance said finally. You are suggesting that we slow down, that we hesitate, that we show caution toward the species that murdered 8 billion human beings. I am suggesting that we gather intelligence before. The Zorvathi showed no caution when they burned Earth. Vance interrupted, her voice cold. They did not hesitate. They did not try to understand us. They simply destroyed us. And now you want me to pause, to consider their feelings, to worry about what might be happening in their empire. Admiral, that's not what I have 900,000 ships filled with soldiers who have trained their entire lives for this mission. Their parents died on Earth. Their grandparents died on Earth. They have carried the weight of genocide for 40 years, and now they are finally going to have justice. Vance stood, her eyes burning with barely contained fury. I will not tell them to wait. I will not tell them to be careful. And I will not let your research, your sympathy for monsters undermine what we have built. I have no sympathy for them, Yuki said quietly. I lost family on Earth too. My grandmother, my aunts and uncles, cousins I never got to meet. I want justice as much as anyone, but justice requires understanding, and something is wrong with this mission. Something does not add up. Vance walked to the viewport and stared out at the stars. Your concerns are noted, Doctor. You may return to your research, but do not bring me speculation again. Bring me facts, or bring me nothing. Yuki wanted to argue, but she knew it would be pointless. The Admiral's mind was made up. The entire fleet's mind was made up. They had spent 40 years building toward this moment, and nothing was going to stop them now. She left the ready room and walked slowly back to her laboratory. The corridors of the Retribution were busy with crew members preparing for battle, checking weapons, running drills. Everyone she passed had the same look in their eyes. Determination, anticipation, hunger. These were not people who wanted to understand. These were people who wanted to kill. And Yuki could not blame them. She understood their rage. She shared it, deep in her heart, but understanding did not make her fear go away. Something was waiting for them at Zorvathi Prime. something that was not in any of their battle plans. And Yuki could not shake the feeling that when they found it, everything would change. The weeks passed slowly. The fleet continued its journey through wormhole corridor after wormhole corridor, drawing ever closer to Zorvathi space. Dren Castillo spent his time running combat simulations, drilling his tactical teams, preparing for every possible scenario. But there was one scenario no one had prepared for. One possibility that had never been included in the training programs or the strategic planning sessions. The possibility that when they finally arrived, there would be no enemy to fight. 3 months into the journey, the fleet encountered its first sign that something was wrong. A Zorvathi patrol vessel, drifting dead in space near the entrance to Corridor 92. Scans showed no life signs, no power readings. Nothing but a cold metal hull floating in the void. Admiral Vance ordered a boarding party to investigate. Marines in combat suits cut through the hull and entered the vessel, their helmet cameras broadcasting everything back to the Retribution. What they found was a ghost ship. The Zorvathi crew was dead. All of them, but not from combat. There were no weapon marks, no signs of battle. The Zorvathi soldiers were lying in their quarters, in the corridors, at their duty stations. They looked like they had simply stopped living. Dr. Tanaka analyzed the medical data transmitted by the Marines. The Zorvathi had died from some kind of disease, a virus or bacteria that had killed them quickly and painfully. Judging by the positions of the bodies, they had suffered before the end. This is consistent with the quarantine warnings I've been tracking, Yuki reported to the Admiral. Some kind of plague has spread through the Zorvathi population. This ship must have been caught in the infected zone. Vance studied the images on her screen. Dead Zorvathi. Rotting bodies. The enemy reduced to corpses without humanity lifting a finger. It could be a trap, Commander Chen suggested. A bioweapon designed to infect our boarding parties. Possible, Vance agreed. Pull our people out and destroy the vessel. We continue on schedule. The Marines evacuated, and the Retribution's weapons reduced the ghost ship to atoms. The fleet moved on, leaving nothing behind but debris and questions. But the ghost ship was not the last. As they drew closer to Zorvathi space, they found more. Dozens of vessels, drifting and dead. Space stations, dark and silent. Communication relays, still broadcasting automated messages to no one. The messages were the same. Quarantine warnings, distress calls, pleas for help that would never be answered. Dren watched the boarding party footage from each vessel, seeing the same horror repeated over and over. Dead Zorvathi, empty ships, an empire dying in silence. He should have been happy. These were the creatures that had destroyed Earth. They deserved to suffer. They deserved to die. But something about the scale of it disturbed him. Something about finding an enemy already broken, already defeated by something other than human weapons. It felt wrong. It felt like their revenge was being stolen. He pushed the thought aside. It did not matter how the Zorvathi died. What mattered was that humanity would be the one to finish them off. What mattered was that someone would be there to watch their final moment, to make sure they knew who had come for them and why. The fleet made its final jump. The last wormhole corridor twisted and roared around them, and then they emerged into real space at the edge of the Zorvathi home system. Dren's tactical screens lit up with contacts, thousands of them, ships everywhere, clustered around the planets, filling the void between worlds. "Contact!" he shouted. "Multiple contacts across all sectors. I'm reading." He stopped. He stared at his screens, unable to believe what he was seeing. "Lieutenant Commander?" Admiral Vance's voice was sharp. "Report." Dren looked up, his face pale. "Admiral, the contacts. They're not moving. None of them are moving. They're all drifting. Dark. Dead." Silence fell over the bridge. Every officer stared at their screens, seeing the same thing. Thousands of Zorvathi warships, floating lifelessly in space. No power signatures, no life signs, no threats. Admiral Vance rose from her chair and walked slowly to the main viewport. Before her stretched the Zorvathi home system, the heart of the empire that had destroyed Earth. It should have been a fortress, bristling with weapons, defended by the mightiest fleet in the galaxy. Instead, it was a graveyard. "Launch reconnaissance drones," she ordered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to know what happened here. I want to know everything." The drones spread out through the system, transmitting images back to the fleet. Warships, cold and dead. orbital stations, dark and empty, and at the center of it all, Zorvath Prime itself, the planet that had ordered Earth's destruction, the throne world of an interstellar empire, the target of humanity's 40-year quest for vengeance. It was still there. It was still intact. But something was terribly, terribly wrong. Admiral Vance stared at the planet that should have been her enemy's final stronghold. 900,000 warships waited behind her, weapons armed and ready, crews hungry for battle. But there was no battle to fight. There was no enemy to destroy. There was only silence and death, and the terrible realization that something had stolen humanity's revenge. What happened here? Commander Chen whispered, voicing the question that echoed through every ship in the fleet. No one had an answer. Not yet. But they were going to find out. The fleet moved forward, into the graveyard of giants, searching for answers in a dead empire. And with every passing moment, the weight of 40 years of preparation pressed down harder on Admiral Vance's shoulders. They had come to destroy the Zorvathi. But someone, or something, had beaten them to it. The question was, what? The reconnaissance drones spread across the Zorvathi home system like seeds scattered by the wind. They darted between dead warships, circled silent space stations, descended through the atmosphere of Zorvath Prime. And everywhere they went, they found the same thing. Death, silence, emptiness. Admiral Kira Vance watched the footage from her command chair, her face carved from stone. The tactical displays that should have shown enemy positions and threat assessments instead showed nothing but debris fields and drifting hulks. The weapon systems that should have been targeting Zorvathi warships sat idle, their crews waiting for orders that made no sense anymore. Initial reports coming in from the surface teams, Commander Chen announced. Admiral, you need to see this. The main view screen shifted to show footage from a Marine reconnaissance squad. They were walking through a Zorvathi city, their boots echoing on empty streets. Buildings towered on either side, their architecture alien and imposing. But their windows were dark. Vehicles sat abandoned where their drivers had left them. Doors hung open, swinging gently in the wind. And everywhere, there were bodies, not fresh bodies. These Zorvathi had been dead for years, maybe decades. Their remains were scattered throughout the city, lying in doorways and on sidewalks and slumped over control consoles. The plague that had killed them had struck quickly, giving them no time to organize, no time to fight back. They had simply fallen where they stood and never gotten up again. God, someone on the bridge whispered. What happened to them? The question hung in the air, unanswered. The Marine squad continued through the city, documenting everything. Hospitals overflowing with corpses, government buildings where officials had died at their desks, schools where teachers and students had perished together. The scale of the death was almost impossible to comprehend. And this was just one city. The drones were reporting similar scenes across the entire planet, across the entire system, across what had once been the mightiest empire in the known galaxy. The Zorvathi were gone, not defeated, not conquered, gone. A civilization of over 200 billion beings, reduced to ruins and bones. Admiral Vance turned to Dr. Tanaka, who was watching the footage with tears streaming down her face. The xenoanthropologist had spent her career studying the Zorvathi from a distance. Now she was seeing them up close for the first time, and they were all dead. Doctor, Vance said, her voice flat. I need answers. What killed them? Yuki wiped her eyes and pulled up her analysis on a datapad. Based on the preliminary medical scans, it appears to be a biological agent, a virus or bacterium specifically engineered to target Zorvathi physiology. Extremely lethal, extremely contagious. It would have spread through their population like wildfire. A bioweapon, Commander Chen said. Someone attacked them with a bioweapon. Yes, but the question is who? Yuki hesitated, then continued. Admiral, I've been analyzing the genetic structure of the pathogen. It's not natural. It was definitely engineered. And the engineering signatures match Zorvathi biotechnology. Vance stared at her. You're saying they did this to themselves? I'm saying the weapon that killed them was made by their own scientists. Whether they released it intentionally or by accident, I cannot yet determine. But this was not an attack by an outside force. This was their own creation. The bridge fell silent. 900,000 warships, built over 40 years, crewed by soldiers burning for revenge. all gathered around a dead world to fight an enemy that had already been destroyed by its own hands. Dren Castillo sat at his tactical station, trying to process what he was hearing. This was not how it was supposed to happen. They were supposed to arrive in a blaze of glory, guns firing, missiles flying. They were supposed to carve their vengeance into the heart of the Zorvathi Empire with plasma and steel. They were supposed to watch their enemies die and know that humanity had won. Instead, they had arrived too late. The victory had already happened, and they had played no part in it. Admiral Vance rose from her chair. "I'm going down to the surface," she announced. "I want to see this for myself." Commander Chen stepped forward. "Admiral, we haven't confirmed the pathogen is inactive. The risk." "I don't care about the risk." Vance's voice was sharp. "Dangerous. I have waited 41 years to stand in the ashes of the Zorvathi Empire. I will not do it through a view screen. Prepare my shuttle." An hour later, Vance's shuttle touched down in the central plaza of the Zorvathi capital city. She stepped onto alien soil for the first time in her life, surrounded by Marine guards and scientific personnel. The air was thin and cold, filtered through her helmet, carrying the faint chemical smell of decay even after all these years. The city stretched around her in every direction. It had been beautiful once, she could tell. Graceful towers reaching toward the sky, gardens filled with strange plants, public spaces designed for millions of beings to gather and live and work. The Zorvathi had built something impressive here, something that spoke of culture and civilization and achievement. And now it was a tomb. Vance walked through the silent streets, past the bodies of her enemies, past the wreckage of their world. Her Marines spread out around her, securing positions out of habit even though there was no threat. Dr. Tanaka followed close behind, scanning everything, collecting samples, documenting the death of a species. They reached the Imperial Palace, a massive structure at the heart of the city. Its gates stood open, unguarded. Vance walked through them without hesitation, her boots echoing on marble floors that no living Zorvathi would ever walk again. The throne room was vast. Banners hung from the ceiling, faded and torn. Pillars lined the walls, carved with images of conquest and glory. And at the far end, on a raised platform, sat the imperial throne. It was empty now, but the body of the last Zorvathi emperor lay before it, collapsed in death like all his subjects. Vance approached the throne and looked down at the corpse of the being who had ordered Earth's destruction. He was tall, even lying down. His scales had once been bright purple, the color of royalty, but they had faded to gray in death. His eyes were empty sockets, staring at nothing. This was the monster she had come to kill. This was the architect of genocide. And he was already dead, had been dead for years, rotting in his palace while humanity spent decades building weapons to destroy him. Vance stood over the body for a long time, saying nothing. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You murdered my daughter. You murdered my grandchildren. You murdered 8 billion people. And I never got to watch you die. I never got to see fear in your eyes. I never got to tell you why." She kicked the corpse. It crumbled slightly, ancient and fragile. "Do you understand what you've stolen from me? It wasn't enough that you took Earth. Now you've taken my revenge too. You died by your own hand, your own stupidity, your own cruelty turned against yourself. And I will never, never get to punish you the way you deserved." Her voice cracked. For the first time in 40 years, Admiral Kira Vance felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Not tears of grief, not tears of joy, tears of rage and frustration, and a loss so profound she could not name it. She had built her entire life around this moment. She had sacrificed everything, her health, her relationships, her sanity, for the chance to stand over the ruins of the Zorvathi Empire and claim victory for humanity. And now that moment had come, and it meant nothing. The enemy was already dust. There was no victory. There was only emptiness. Dr. Tanaka approached carefully. "Admiral, are you all right?" Vance laughed bitterly. "All right? I just discovered that the purpose of my entire existence was pointless. I'm wonderful, Doctor. Absolutely wonderful." She turned away from the throne and walked toward the windows. Outside, she could see more of the dead city, more ruins, more corpses. The empire that had terrified the galaxy was gone, wiped out by a plague of its own making. "Tell me what you've learned," she said, her voice steadier now. "Tell me how this happened." Dr. Tanaka consulted her datapad. Based on records we've recovered from government facilities, the plague began approximately 32 years ago, shortly after the destruction of Earth. How shortly? Within months. The virus was developed by the Zorvathi military caste as a weapon for future conquests. It was designed to be incredibly lethal to other species, while leaving Zorvathi immune. But something went wrong during the victory celebrations after Earth's destruction. A containment failure. The virus escaped into the general population. Vance listened in silence, her jaw tight. At first they thought they could contain it. They quarantined affected areas, restricted travel, implemented emergency protocols. But the virus spread too fast. It had been engineered to be unstoppable, and it proved exactly that. Within 5 years, it had reached every corner of their empire. Within 10 years, their civilization had effectively collapsed. By 20 years, there were only scattered survivors left, isolated pockets of population too small to maintain any kind of organized society. How many survive now? Our estimates suggest approximately 3 million Zorvathi remain alive, scattered across the empire in small settlements, surviving on subsistence, agriculture, and salvage. They no longer have space travel. They no longer have advanced technology. They're essentially living in the ruins of their ancestors' achievements. 3 million out of 200 billion. The Zorvathi had killed more of their own people than they had killed humans when they burned Earth. Poetic justice, Commander Chen said over the comm link. They created a weapon of genocide, and it turned on them. They destroyed themselves. Is that really justice? Dr. Tanaka asked quietly. They intended to use that weapon against other species that had done nothing to them. The plague that killed them would have killed billions more if they had deployed it as planned. Their death was an accident, not punishment. It was random chance, not justice. Does it matter? Vance asked. They're dead. That's what matters. But we didn't kill them. Doesn't that matter? For 40 years, we've told ourselves that we would have justice, that we would avenge Earth, that the Zorvathi would pay for their crimes, and now we discover that nature already handled it for us. Does that give us closure? Does that give us peace? Vance turned to face the xenoanthropologist. What would you have me do, Doctor? They're dead. There's no one left to punish. There's no war to fight. The enemy destroyed themselves before we could reach them. We can't change that. We can only decide what to do now. And what will you do? It was the question that Vance had been avoiding since they first entered the Zorvathi system. The question that haunted her as she walked through the dead cities and looked at the corpses of her enemies. The question that had no easy answer. She had 900,000 warships. She had millions of soldiers. She had the combined might of a species that had spent 40 years preparing for war. And now there was no war to fight. The fleet had been built for a single purpose, and that purpose no longer existed. What happened now? What did humanity become when there was no enemy to defeat? When the revenge that had driven them for 4 decades suddenly lost all meaning? Vance looked out at the dead city one more time. Somewhere in those ruins, in those millions of corpses, was the crew of the planet Crackers that had burned Earth. Somewhere in this cemetery of a civilization were the soldiers who had murdered 8 billion people and celebrated afterward. They were dead now. They had suffered, according to the medical reports. The plague had not been kind. They had felt pain and terror and despair before the end, but Vance had not been there to see it. She had not been the one to inflict it, and somehow, that made all the difference. We will stay, she said finally. We will investigate. We will document. And then, we will decide our next steps. For now, establish a forward base here. I want full surveys of this system and all surrounding systems. I want to know exactly what remains of the Zorvathi Empire and what state it's in. She turned and began walking back toward the shuttle. And find me the survivors, those 3 million Zorvathi still alive out there. I want to know where they are and what condition they're in. For what purpose, Admiral? Chen asked. Vance paused at the threshold of the throne room. She looked back at the body of the Emperor, lying forgotten before his empty throne, ruler of nothing but dust and memory. I haven't decided yet, she said. Maybe I'll kill them all. Maybe I'll let them live. Maybe I'll find something in between. But whatever I decide, it will be my choice. Mine and humanity's. The The Zorvathi don't get to choose their fate anymore. That privilege belongs to us, now. She walked out of the palace and into the cold light of an alien sun, surrounded by the ruins of the empire that had destroyed her world. 900,000 warships waited in orbit, weapons ready for a battle that would never come. The universe had given humanity an unexpected gift, a dead enemy and an empty empire. What they did with that gift would determine everything that came next. And standing in the ashes of Zorvath Prime, Admiral Kira Vance realized that her war was not over. It had simply changed. The question was no longer how to destroy the Zorvathi. The question was what kind of species humanity wanted to become. The news spread through the fleet like fire through dry grass. Within hours, every soldier, every officer, every crew member knew the truth. The Zorvathi were dead, not by human hands, but by their own plague. The enemy they had trained their entire lives to destroy was already destroyed. The vengeance they had dreamed of for 40 years would never come. The reactions were as varied as humanity itself. Some felt relief. The war was over before it began. No human lives would be lost in battle. The Zorvathi had paid for their crimes, even if humanity had not been the one to collect the debt. Some felt joy. The monsters were dead. Who cared how it happened? Earth was avenged. Justice had been served. The universe had punished the guilty, but many felt something else, something darker, a rage that had no outlet, a hunger that could not be fed. They had prepared for war. They had dreamed of war, and now they were being told that the war was already won. Without them, without their sacrifice, without the satisfaction of watching their enemies burn. For these soldiers, the empty victory was no victory at all. It was theft. The universe had stolen their purpose. The first arguments erupted within days. What should be done with the survivors? 3 million Zorvathi remained alive, scattered across the empire in primitive settlements. They had no weapons, no ships, no way to threaten humanity. They were helpless, broken, living on scraps in the ruins of their civilization. Admiral Vance convened a council of fleet commanders to discuss the options. The meeting took place aboard the Retribution, in the war room that had been designed to plan the destruction of the Zorvathi Empire. Now it was being used to decide the fate of the last Zorvathi alive. The arguments were fierce. We should finish them, Admiral Chenwei argued, his face hard. Every last one. They killed 8 billion of us. They don't deserve to survive. They don't deserve mercy. Let us end this properly, once and for all. They're refugees, Commander Malik Hassan countered. Starving, frightened refugees living in caves and shacks. Killing them wouldn't be war. It would be murder, genocide. We would become exactly what they were. They are what they were, Chen shot back. The plague didn't change their nature. Given the chance, they would destroy us again without hesitation. The only safe Zorvathi is a dead Zorvathi. The ones who destroyed Earth are already dead. The survivors are their descendants, children, grandchildren, people who had no part in the decision to burn our world. Can we really execute them for crimes they didn't commit? The debate continued for hours, voices rising and falling, the room growing hot with tension and emotion. Admiral Vance listened in silence, letting her commanders speak, cataloging their arguments and watching their faces. She was divided herself. Part of her agreed with Chen. The Zorvathi had shown humanity no mercy. They deserved none in return. Wiping them out would ensure they could never threaten humanity again. It would be the final chapter in the story of Earth's revenge. But another part of her, a smaller voice that she had ignored for 40 years, whispered different words. What would Maya think? What would her daughter, the school teacher who believed in second chances, say if she could see her mother now? Would she want her to slaughter helpless refugees? Would she want humanity to become a species of murderers? The council ended without resolution. Vance dismissed her commanders and retreated to her quarters, the weight of decision pressing down on her like gravity itself. Lieutenant Commander Dren Castillo was not part of the council, but the debates reached every corner of the fleet. In crew quarters and mess halls, in engineering bays and fighter hangars, soldiers argued about what should be done. Dren found himself torn. He had grown up hating the Zorvathi with every fiber of his being. They were the enemy. They were monsters. They had taken everything from humanity and deserved to be erased from existence. But the Zorvathi he had seen in the footage from the surface were not monsters. They were corpses, victims of their own plague, lying in their homes and workplaces, rotting away to nothing. And the survivors described in the intelligence reports were not warriors. They were scavengers, survivors, people trying to stay alive in a galaxy that had already punished them beyond measure. He needed to see for himself. He needed to understand. Dren requested permission to join a survey team heading to one of the surviving Zorvathi settlements. His request was approved. 3 days later, he was on a shuttle descending through the atmosphere of a planet called Zorvathi Tertius, toward a collection of crude buildings huddled in a valley between dead forests. The shuttle landed outside the settlement, and Dren stepped onto alien soil for the first time in his life. The air was breathable but thin, with a metallic taste that made him want to cough. The landscape was brown and gray, the colors of a world dying slowly from neglect. The survey team approached the settlement carefully, weapons ready but not raised. They had been told not to expect resistance, but old habits died hard. These were Zorvathi. Even now, even helpless, the name carried weight. The settlement was smaller than Dren expected, perhaps 200 structures, built from salvaged materials and rough stone. No technology visible, no vehicles, no communications equipment. The Zorvathi who emerged to meet them were thin and ragged, their scales dull with malnutrition, their eyes hollow with fear. They did not resist. They did not attack. They simply stared at the human soldiers with expressions that Dren could only interpret as despair, as resignation, as the look of people who had been waiting for death and finally saw it arriving. One of the Zorvathi stepped forward, older than the others, with faded purple scales that might once have been impressive. He spoke in the Zorvathi language, his voice weak and trembling. Dr. Tanaka had been teaching Dren basic Zorvathi for weeks. He understood only fragments, but enough to get the meaning. You are humans. You have come to finish us. We understand. We accept. Please make it quick. Dren stared at the alien. This was his enemy. This was a member of the species that had destroyed Earth, and he was begging for a quick death, resigned to extinction, expecting nothing but the final blow. We're not here to kill you, Dren heard himself say. The translator device on his uniform converted his words to Zorvathi. We're here to survey, to understand, to see what remains. The old Zorvathi looked confused. You will not execute us? Not today. Not unless you give us a reason. The confusion deepened into something that might have been hope, fragile and disbelieving. We have waited 30 years for this moment. Since the plague took everything, we knew humans would come eventually. We knew you would want revenge. We have accepted it. Our ancestors committed a great evil. We have lived in the shadow of that evil our entire lives. Dren did not know how to respond. He had expected many things from this encounter. Hostility, perhaps. Defiance. Maybe even pride. He had not expected acceptance. He had not expected an enemy who acknowledged their guilt and waited patiently for punishment. The survey continued through the day. Dren walked through the settlement, observing the Zorvathi going about their meager existence. They had little food, gathered from the dying land around them. No medicine, no tools beyond what they could make by hand. They were living in the ruins of their ancestors' achievements, remembering what had been lost, waiting for the end. Near the center of the settlement, Dren found a group of Zorvathi children playing in the dirt. They were small and thin, their scales still developing, their eyes wide with curiosity as they watched the human soldiers pass. One of them broke away from the group and approached Dren, holding something in its small hands. It was a drawing, crude, made with plant pigments on rough paper. It showed a circle, colored blue and green, floating in a black sky. What is this? Dren asked, pointing at the drawing. The child looked up at him and spoke words that the translator rendered haltingly. The beautiful world. The one we killed. The elders tell stories about it. They say it was the most beautiful place in all the stars. They say we destroyed it, and that is why the gods punished us. Dren took the drawing from the child's hands. He stared at it, this crude representation of Earth, drawn by a being who had never seen it, who knew it only as a legend of guilt and shame. To this child, Earth was not a world that had been murdered. It was a sin, a warning, a reason for everything bad that had happened to the Zorvathi. He had come here expecting monsters. He had found children who drew pictures of his homeworld and told stories about the evil their ancestors had committed. Dren returned to the Retribution that night with more questions than answers. The rage that had burned in him for his entire life was still there, but it was no longer simple. It was no longer pure. The Zorvathi were his enemy, but they were also people, broken, starving, dying people who had inherited the consequences of crimes they had not committed. What did justice look like now? What did vengeance mean when the guilty were already dead and only the innocent remained? Admiral Vance was asking herself the same questions. In her quarters, she replayed recordings from the survey teams, watching footage of Zorvathi settlements across the former empire. Everywhere, the same story. Survivors living in poverty, waiting for death, accepting their fate. Dr. Tanaka came to her with a proposal. It was radical, perhaps impossible, but it was the first idea that offered something other than destruction or stalemate. Admiral, we have 900,000 warships and 12 million humans with no homeworld. The Zorvathi have dozens of habitable planets, crumbling infrastructure, and a dying population that cannot maintain any of it. What if we stopped thinking of this as a war and started thinking of it as an opportunity? Vance looked at her sharply. Explain. The Zorvathi Empire is dead. The Empire, Admiral, not the species. 3 million survivors remain, but they have nothing. No ships, no weapons, no organization, no hope. Meanwhile, humanity has everything except land to stand on. We've been living in space for 40 years, dreaming of Earth, but we can never go back to Earth. It's gone. Tanaka leaned forward, her eyes bright with conviction. The Zorvathi took our home, but now we have the chance to take theirs. Not through conquest, not through genocide, but through inheritance. We take their worlds. We rebuild their cities. We make their empire into our empire. Humanity inherits the stars. And the survivors? The 3 million Zorvathi still alive? That's the harder question. But there are options. We could exile them to the outer territories, give them a few barren worlds to call their own, let them live out their days away from us, remembering what they lost. Or, Tanaka hesitated, or we could integrate them, slowly, over generations, let them become part of the new civilization we're building. Show them that humanity can be better than the Zorvathi ever were. Vance sat in silence for a long moment. The idea was audacious, insane even, but it also made a terrible kind of sense. Humanity needed a home. The Zorvathi worlds were empty. The equation was simple. If you could look past the oceans of blood that separated the two species, you're asking me to forgive them, she said finally. No, Tanaka replied. I'm not asking you to forgive anything. What the Zorvathi did was unforgivable. Nothing will ever change that. Nothing will ever make it right. But we're not talking about the past anymore. We're talking about the future. And the future is not about revenge. It's about survival. It's about what we become next. Vance thought about her daughter, Maya, who had believed in second chances. Maya, who had dedicated her life to teaching children, to helping them become better than they were. What would Maya want her to do? She didn't know. She would never know. Her daughter was dead, reduced to atoms when Earth burned, her voice silenced forever. But somewhere in her memory, Vance could still hear that voice, gentle and patient and full of hope. Let me think about it, she told Tanaka. Let me think. But even as she said the words, she knew that she was already thinking, already considering, already imagining a future that looked different from the one she had planned for 40 years. The war was over. The enemy was dead. All that remained was the decision that would shape humanity's future for centuries to come. And standing in her quarters, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the possibilities of the future, Admiral Kira Vance began to realize that maybe, just maybe, there was something more important than revenge. Maybe there was tomorrow. Admiral Kira Vance stood on the bridge of the Retribution, looking out at the fleet that had carried humanity's hope for 40 years. 900,000 warships hung in the void around Zorvath Prime, their weapons cold, their purpose uncertain. For days, the fleet had waited, crews restless and divided, while their commander wrestled with a decision that would shape the future of their species. The time for waiting was over. Vance opened a channel to the entire fleet. Her face appeared on screens in every ship, from the smallest fighter to the largest dreadnought. Millions of eyes turned toward her, Waiting, hoping, fearing, she had prepared a speech. She had written and rewritten it dozens of times, trying to find the perfect words to explain what she was feeling, what she had decided, what she wanted humanity to become. But standing there, looking at the faces of her soldiers, she realized that perfect words did not exist. There was only truth. 41 years ago, she began, her voice steady. I watched Earth burn. I watched the world where I was born, where I raised my daughter, where my grandchildren were taking their first steps, disappear in fire and ash. 8 billion people died that day. My family among them, my life among them, everything I had ever loved, gone in 17 hours. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the fleet. I survived because I was on Mars. A routine patrol assignment. Nothing special. Just chance. Just luck. And for 41 years, I have carried the guilt of that survival. Why me? Why was I allowed to live when so many others died? What made me worthy of drawing another breath when my daughter never would? The bridge crew watched her in silence. No one moved. No one spoke. I found my answer in revenge. I told myself that I had survived for a reason, that my purpose was to make the Zorvathi pay for what they had done, that I would spend every remaining day of my life building the weapon that would destroy them. And I did. We all did. Together, we built this fleet. Together, we created the most powerful military force the galaxy has ever seen. Together, we prepared for the day when we would balance the scales and avenge our murdered world. She gestured toward the viewport, toward the dead planet hanging in space beyond. And now we are here, at the heart of the Zorvathi Empire, standing in the ashes of our enemy. And what do we find? Nothing. Empty ships, dead cities, a civilization destroyed by its own cruelty. The monsters who burned Earth are already dead, killed by a plague of their own making. The victory we spent 40 years earning has been stolen from us. Vance could feel the restless energy in the fleet, the frustration, the rage. These were people who had been promised war, promised vengeance, promised a chance to strike back at the enemy who had taken everything from them. And now she was telling them that none of it would happen. I know what many of you are thinking, she continued. I have felt it myself. The unfairness of it. The hollow emptiness of arriving too late. We wanted to watch them die. We wanted to be the ones who pulled the trigger. We wanted them to know, in their final moments, that humanity had come for them. And now that chance is gone forever. She took a deep breath. So what do we do now? Some of you want to finish the job. Hunt down the survivors. Kill every last Zorvathi alive. Regardless of whether they were involved in Earth's destruction, turn genocide into extinction. End the story once and for all. The words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. I understand that desire. I have felt it. Part of me still feels it. These creatures killed my daughter. They killed my grandchildren. They killed billions of innocent people for no reason other than cruelty and contempt. They deserve to be erased from existence. They deserve to be forgotten. Her voice hardened. But if we do that, if we slaughter the helpless to satisfy our grief, what do we become? The Zorvathi destroyed Earth because they saw us as insects, inferior beings, unworthy of life. They killed us without hesitation, without mercy, without a second thought. If we respond with the same brutality, the same indifference to suffering, then we do not defeat them. We become them. She thought of her daughter, Maya, who had believed in second chances. Maya, who had seen the best in people even when they did not deserve it. Maya, who would have been horrified by the hatred her mother had carried for 40 years. My daughter was a school teacher, Vance said, her voice softer now. She spent her life helping children become better than they were. She believed that people could grow, could change, could learn from their mistakes. She believed in kindness, even when kindness was hard. And when I stand here, deciding the fate of millions, I ask myself what she would want me to do. Tears formed in her eyes, but she did not wipe them away. I do not know if I can forgive the Zorvathi. I do not know if anyone should. What they did was unforgivable. But forgiveness is not the only choice. There is another path, a harder path, a path that honors what we lost without becoming what we hate. She straightened, her voice growing stronger. Humanity came here to destroy an empire. But we found something else instead. We found opportunity. The Zorvathi have dozens of habitable worlds. They have cities and infrastructure and resources beyond counting, and they can no longer use any of it. Their civilization is dead. Only remnants remain. The fleet listened, beginning to understand. We have spent 40 years living in space, drifting from station to station, ship to ship, dreaming of a home we could never return to. 12 million humans, wandering the void like ghosts. But we do not have to wander anymore. The Zorvathi took our home from us. Now we will take theirs. Vance's eyes blazed with new purpose. Not through genocide, not through murder, through inheritance. We will claim these worlds as our own. We will rebuild these cities with human hands. We will turn the Zorvathi Empire into a new beginning for our species. This will not be Earth. Nothing will ever be Earth, but it can be home. She addressed the question she knew everyone was asking. And the survivors? The 3 million Zorvathi still alive? They will be given a choice. They can accept exile to the outer territories, a handful of barren worlds where they can live out their days in isolation. Or they can remain under human law, with the understanding that integration will take generations. Their ancestors committed a great evil. That evil will not be forgotten, but their children and their children's children will have the chance to earn a place in the civilization we build. Vance knew this would not satisfy everyone. Some would never accept any solution that left Zorvathi alive. But she was not speaking to them anymore. I know this is not the victory we imagined. I know this is not the vengeance we dreamed of. But we did not survive 40 years in the darkness just to become murderers. We survived because humanity is resilient, because we adapt, because we find ways forward, even when every path seems blocked. She spread her arms, encompassing the fleet, the dead world, the empty empire waiting to be claimed. Earth is gone. We cannot bring it back. But we can honor its memory by building something new, something worthy of the world we lost, something that proves humanity cannot be destroyed, cannot be erased, cannot be beaten down into extinction. The Zorvathi tried to end our story. Instead, they gave us the stars. Her voice rose to a crescendo. This fleet was built to destroy. Now it will build. These weapons were forged for war. Now they will protect peace. These soldiers trained to kill. Now they will create. We came here as conquerors. We leave here as inheritors. And in 1,000 years, when our descendants look back at this moment, they will not remember vengeance. They will remember the day humanity chose to live. She stood tall, her eyes dry now, her voice clear and commanding. The Zorvathi called themselves masters of the galaxy. They called us insects, vermin to be exterminated. But they are dust now, and we remain. We survived their genocide. We survived 40 years in exile, and we will survive this too. We will take what they built and make it ours. We will transform their empire into humanity's cradle. And in the end, we will prove that they failed. Not because we killed them, but because we outlived them. Because we built something better than they ever could. She raised her hand in salute. Soldiers of humanity, we have reached the end of one journey and the beginning of another. Remember Earth. Remember what we lost. Remember the cost of hatred and the price of cruelty. But do not let memory become a prison. Do not let the past determine the future. We are more than survivors. We are builders. We are dreamers. We are human. Her final words echoed through 900,000 ships. Today, we choose what we become. And I choose hope. I choose tomorrow. I choose to believe that my daughter would be proud of what we build here. Soldiers of humanity, the war is over. Now the work begins. The channel closed. Silence held the fleet for a long moment. Then, slowly, voices began to rise. Not all of them were happy. Not all of them agreed. Some ships signaled their intention to leave, unable to accept mercy for the enemy that had taken everything from them. Vance let them go. She understood their rage. She shared it, but she would not force them to follow a path they could not walk. Most of the fleet remained. 900,000 ships became 800,000, then 700,000 as the dissenters departed into the void. But the majority stayed. The majority believed. The majority chose hope. Over the following months, humanity began the work of reclamation. Engineers surveyed Zorvathi infrastructure. identifying what could be salvaged and what needed to be rebuilt. Scientists studied Zorvathi technology, adapting it for human use. Colonists began arriving, settling into empty cities, planting gardens in abandoned parks, bringing life back to worlds that had known only death for decades. Dren Castillo returned to the settlement on Zorvathi Tertius several times. He brought food and medicine, supplies the survivors desperately needed. He watched the Zorvathi children grow stronger, their scales brightening with proper nutrition. He learned their names, their stories, their fears, and slowly, grudgingly, he began to see them as something other than enemies. The old Zorvathi who had greeted him on that first day became a regular contact. His name was Torvak, and he had been a historian before the plague. He knew the truth about Earth's destruction. He knew what his ancestors had done, and he spent his remaining years teaching the younger generation to remember the crime, to honor the victims, to ensure that such evil was never repeated. Dr. Yuki Tanaka continued her research, documenting the history of both species, recording the story of how humanity came to inherit the Zorvathi Empire. She wrote books that would be read for generations, explaining the choices that had been made and the reasons behind them. She became a bridge between the two species, helping them understand each other even when understanding was difficult. And Admiral Kira Vance oversaw it all. She watched the cities rise from ruins, the ships transform from weapons into tools, the soldiers become settlers. She watched humanity plant its flag on 100 worlds, building the foundation of a new civilization among the stars. 1 year after the fleet's arrival, Vance stood on a balcony overlooking the capital of Zorvath Prime, now called New Terra. The city had been transformed. Human architecture rose alongside Zorvathi structures, creating something new, something that belonged to neither species alone. In the square below, children played, human and Zorvathi together, their laughter echoing off ancient walls. Commander Chenwei approached her, carrying a datapad. "Admiral, the Council has finalized the new inscription. They want your approval before they begin carving it." Vance took the pad and read the words that would be carved into every ship, every monument, every building in the new human civilization. "Remember Earth, but live for tomorrow." She smiled, the first genuine smile she could remember in 40 years. "Approved." Chen nodded and turned to leave, but Vance called him back. "Commander, do you remember what you asked me before we left on this mission? What would happen to us when the war was over?" "I remember, Admiral." She looked out at the city, at the children playing, at the future being built before her eyes. "I think I finally have an answer. We become something new, something we never expected, something better." Chen followed her gaze, seeing what she saw. Hope, growth, tomorrow. "I think you're right, Admiral. I think you're right." That night, Vance returned to her quarters and pulled out the holographic photo of her daughter. Maya smiled at her, frozen forever in a moment of joy, a reminder of everything that had been lost. "I don't know if I did the right thing," Vance whispered to the image. "I don't know if you would approve. But I tried, Maya. I tried to be better than my rage. I tried to build something instead of destroy something. And maybe, in the end, that's enough. Maybe that's what you would have wanted." The photo smiled back at her, saying nothing, judging nothing. But in the silence, Vance felt something she had not felt in 41 years. Peace. Outside her window, the first stars of evening appeared over New Terra. Somewhere in that vast darkness, humanity was spreading across the galaxy, claiming worlds, building cities, creating a future. They carried the memory of Earth with them, a wound that would never fully heal, a loss that would never be forgotten. But they also carried hope. They carried possibility. They carried the stubborn, beautiful belief that tomorrow could be better than today. The Zorvathi had sent their fleets to destroy humanity. They had burned Earth and killed billions and believed they had won. But standing in the ashes of their empire, building a new civilization from the ruins of the old, humanity proved them wrong. Not through revenge, not through genocide, through survival, through adaptation, through the simple, profound choice to keep living, to keep building, to keep believing that life was worth living. The war was over, the enemy was gone, and humanity, against all odds, had won, not by destroying their enemies, but by outliving them, not by burning worlds, but by building new ones. Not by choosing hate, but by choosing hope. The shift was complete. The story was just beginning, and somewhere in the stars, the children of Earth looked up at the night sky and dreamed of tomorrow.